The cinema of Dario Argento is the cinema of excess. While some believe in a less is more approach when it comes to horror, Argento's vivid celluloid nightmares dismiss the notion that what we don't see is most frightening. Argento leaves little to the viewer's imagination, instead holding them captive within his own, plunging them into grandiose dreamscapes in which death is the ultimate work of art. While Mario Bava's 1963 thriller The Girl Who Knew Too Much is recognised as the first giallo film, Argento's acclaimed debut from 1970, The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, not only perfected and popularised the subgenre, but also provided a blueprint for the thematic and visual obsessions Argento would return to throughout his career. The fish-out-of-water protagonist, the fallibility of perception and memory, his kinetic camera work and penetrating close-ups, prowling POV shots from black glove killers, and of course elaborately staged murder set pieces. But perhaps his most recognisable trademark, not fully realised until his sixth feature, is his boldly anti-realist use of colour. Abandoning the murder mysteries for which his name had become synonymous, Suspiria saw Argento take a leap of faith into the supernatural, where a prestigious school of dance is home to a malevolent coven of witches. Rather than cloaking the labyrinthine halls of the Tanz Academy in ominous shadows, Argento paints in phantasmic primary hues against a cacophonous backdrop of pulsating soundscapes, drawing inspiration not from Gothic artworks, but from Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which Argento specifically requested cinematographer Luciano Tivoli watch in preparation.
Now, begin thy magic spell.
Further ensuring his dynamic shades truly pop, Argento shot on Eastman Color Kodak stock and employed the same 3-strip Technicolor process used by cinema's most vibrant flight of fantasy, The Wizard of Oz. And one thing is immediately clear in Suspiria: we're not in Kansas anymore.
You're going to meet death now!
Bathed in the super-saturated shocks of reds, greens and blues, Argento's macabre wonderland is a sensory overload of geometric patterns, Art Nouveau interiors, gaudy stained glass and Rococo furniture. Not just there to unsettle, the kaleidoscopic palette supports and propels the film's narrative, the persistent use of red in particular infecting everything with an overwhelming and inescapable threat of danger, with contrasting primary colours signalling the swelling power of the coven, holding students captive in prismatic prisons from which they can't escape. The psychedelic symbolism of Suspiria is used to similar effect by Stanley Kubrick in his giallo-tinged Eyes Wide Shut. While not a horror film, Kubrick's hyper-real red and blue brushstrokes can feel insidiously unnerving and at times quite terrifying. Suspiria's spiritual sequel, Inferno, employs a pared-back colour palette of mostly red and blue, in equally disconcerting ways. The dual tones seem in battle, filling different parts of the frame, vying for our attention. Characters walk from one colour into the other, as though the spaces they inhabit are in constant flux. Are we in heaven or hell? Is this good or evil? Life or death? As in Suspiria, the hallucinatory lighting creates an uncanny dream world, whilst here invoking the neon glows of New York where the film is predominantly set, but wasn't filmed. Coincidentally, Inferno's aesthetic again recalls the fascinating artificiality of Kubrick's polychromatic Eyes Wide Shut, similarly set in New York, but filmed on a soundstage in England. Colour dominates Argento's work, in the garish splashes of impossibly vivid blood that spills from his victims, ironically more bright red than deep red, and even in the titles themselves. Four Flies on Grey Velvet, Deep Red, The Black Cat, and Giallo, the Italian word for yellow. Yet Argento's impressionistic oeuvre can be defined also by an absence of colour. Tenebrae, Argento's return to reality after the Kabbalistic Suspiria and Inferno, comes drenched in a stark white light which bounces off the walls of brutalist buildings and the cold metallic surfaces of modern sculpture. Unlike the lavish textures of Suspiria, Tenebrae's icy sheen renders the corporeal world an achromatic counterpoint to the mystical. Although given Tenebrae's elaborately styled set pieces, a world without colour is not a world devoid of imagination. If Suspiria is a primary coloured night terror and Tenebrae a sun-drenched daymare, then Trauma is a dusky reverie in sepia. While many lament the vivid brushstrokes of his more vibrant work, the desaturated colour palette of Argento's only feature-length US production is as deliberate as the super-saturated ones that came before. Perhaps Argento's lustreless colour scheme was a deliberate attempt to make his typically flamboyant aesthetic more palatable for the American eye. Or maybe it was designed to emulate the dusty terrains of the American Midwest. Either way, Trauma's restrained tones befit one of Argento's most sombre films, once again demonstrating how colour is never just decorative for Argento, but an essential part of the film's DNA. In a genre constantly faced with accusations of misogyny, Argento frequently comes under scrutiny for his treatment of women. Yet his approach to gender is not quite as simplistic as it might first appear. The gender spread of victims across Argento's work is actually surprisingly balanced, with several films boasting a significantly higher male body count, although it would be hard to refute claims that his women suffer more protracted and sadistic slayings. In his testosterone-fueled early gialli, Argento's leading men are frequently characterised by varying degrees of failure, unable to actualise career aspirations, maintain relationships, or successfully play the part of amateur sleuth. They are physically and emotionally impotent, reluctant damsels in distress who, like David Hemming's character in Deep Red, will boldly assert,
"It is a fundamental fact. Men are different from women. Women are weaker,"
before relying on the so-called fairer sex to step in and rescue them. Women didn't take centre stage until Suspiria, which Argento co-wrote with then-partner Dario Argento, herself a regular in Argento's films, whose characters met with increasingly barbaric ends and unsettling trajectory said to mirror the tumultuous terrain of their romantic relationship. In Suspiria, women were everything from gallant heroines to nefarious villains, while men existed on the periphery. It was a bold 360 for Argento, yet it would be naive to label Suspiria feminist, not simply due to the glee with which violence is inflicted upon women's bodies, but because it bears no resemblance to a recognisable world. Suspiria is a phantasmagorical expression of feminine energy in which women can be anything. Anything except real, that is. Post-Suspiria, female protagonists became regular fixtures in Argento's work, most notably the run of Opera, Trauma and the Stendhal Syndrome, each exploring in some way the subjugation of women. Of the three, the Stendhal Syndrome is the most troubling. Not only are its graphic rape scenes anomalous for a director who usually keeps sex and sexual violence off-screen, but the casting of his daughter Asia as Detective Anna Manny adds an additional layer of discomfort. Thankfully, Argento avoided adopting the attacker's POV, as one might have expected, ensuring that Anna is centred during these moments. As with his male-female spread of victims, Argento also sought balance regarding the gender identities of his killers, who are as likely female as they are male, and while several are revealed as queer, intersex and non-binary. While this might call to mind the controversial denouement of sensationalist tween slasher Sleepaway Camp, Argento, in a film such as Four Flies on Grey Velvet, does not equate homicidal behaviour as synonymous with gender nonconformity, instead taking a more sympathetic approach, exploring how enforced binary structures and repeated misgendering could drive someone to madness. Perhaps most importantly, Argento embraces other queer characters who are not killers, nor presented as comic relief, as was then common. They weren't perfect. Detective Arosio from Four Flies on Grey Velvet is portrayed with flamboyant affectation by Jean-Pierre Mariel, and he feels undeniably stereotypical. But while he is funny, he is not a joke, nor defined solely by his sexuality. Carlo from Deep Red also highlights Argento's commitment to inclusion. This character is an alcoholic and a manic depressive, but neither of those factors are linked to his sexuality, and thus avoiding damaging implications that all gay men are destructive self-loathers. We even meet Carlo's genderqueer partner, played by cis-female Geraldine Hooper, in arguably the film's most tender scene.
Io gli voglio tanto bene, ma è sempre così triste.
Sure, Carlo dies, but this is an Italian giallo. Loads of people die, both gay and straight. Significantly for Carlo, his sexuality is not the reason for his death. Argento's surprisingly progressive identity politics continued in Tenebrae, which features a lesbian couple who exist beyond mindless titillation. Early in the film, one half of the couple, journalist Tilda, accuses crime writer Peter Neal of perpetuating gender stereotypes.
Why do you despise women so much?
Sexist? No, I don't think it's sexist.
Women as victims, ciphers, the male heroes with their hairy macho bullshit. How can you say it isn't?
Argento isn't afraid of his queer characters. In fact, he uses them to critique a genre that repeatedly sidelines anyone who isn't a heterosexual cis man, while slipping in his own sly dig at those critics who labelled him a misogynist. Argento's commitment to playing with gender and sexual stereotypes continues throughout his work. Cat o' Nine Tails features a notably unsensationalistic scene in a gay bar. We meet another lesbian couple in Trauma. His Masters of Horror episode Pelts features a bisexual character, a community sorely underrepresented, even in queer cinema. Whilst the casting of trans actress Eva Robbins in Tenebrae's Flashbacks could be a redress of the casting of a cis woman to play Carlo's lover in Deep Red. One could also argue that Argento's operatic extravagance possesses a camp sensibility, making his work appealing and accessible for the likes of gay-identified director Luca Guadagnino to reinterpret, and maybe many more queer directors in the future.
Avanti. Continua.
While Argento's use of colour or subversion of gender stereotypes can be easily identified from film to film, there is another, less tangible characteristic that defines his work. Some may call it a playful disregard of conventional narrative structure, others a commitment to dreamlike surrealism. Basically, his films don't often make a lot of sense. Watertight plots were never Argento's primary concern. From the frequent lapses in logic in The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, via the Byzantine twists and turns of Cat o' Nine Tails, through to the baffling pseudoscience of Four Flies on Grey Velvet, Argento's early films demonstrated his desire for intricate stories to match his flamboyant visuals. In reimagining the crime thriller on both a visual and narrative level, Argento's work has as much in common with the cinema of the avant-garde, which subverts cinematic convention and explores alternative narrative methods, as it does commercial genre cinema. In this context, even the charmingly unsophisticated dubbing of his dialogue can be interpreted as a formal deconstruction of non-diegetic sound and image.
Have you ever heard of Helena Marcos?
Oh yes, she was a very famous Black Queen. A powerful witch with a tremendous talent for doing evil. A real mistress of magic.
Inferno allowed Argento to dispense with conventional logic almost entirely, delving deeper into the supernatural and thus freeing him from the plot-driven shackles of the giallo. While Suspiria retained some semblance of plot, Inferno is a film to experience, not to understand. A film in which impenetrable characters wander aimlessly through a series of exquisitely crafted, yet bafflingly unconnected vignettes. More a Brechtian exercise in disruption than a conventional horror film, Inferno is arguably Argento's most abstract work, sitting more comfortably alongside the likes of Peter Greenaway's Baroque tour de force The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover than other Italian horror films of the 1980s. In the years following Inferno, Argento further embraced the incomprehensible. Bonkers supernatural giallo phenomena sees a schoolgirl, an etymologist, a chimpanzee and an army of insects unite to catch a killer. The Phantom of the Opera, a bracingly unfaithful adaptation of Gaston Leroux's novel, gave new meaning to the term taking liberties, while Dracula 3D, for reasons we may never know, features a giant CGI praying mantis. However, such eccentricities were punctuated by some of his most conventional films, such as The Card Player and Do You Like Hitchcock?
E con questo?
Oh, niente.
So how does one make sense of a filmmaker whose work delights in making no sense? Argento himself defines his films as dreams, a claim hard to refute. Dreams adopt a first-person perspective. They are filled with illogical content and loose ends, which the dreamer unthinkingly accepts. They can elicit intense feelings of dread, anxiety and terror, yet can be hard to recall or piece together in a satisfying way. In describing the characteristics of dreams, one is essentially describing the cinema of Dario Argento. So it seems ironic that for years Argento has been affectionately named the Italian Hitchcock, when Hitchcock's fondness for details and discipline is in many ways the antithesis of Argento's intuitive dreamscapes.
They tell you what you are trying to hide, but they tell it to you all mixed up like pieces of a puzzle that don't fit.
Hitchcock's ends aren't loose, nor is his content illogical. When he does present us with a dream, such as in Spellbound, the results, while spectacular, are too self-consciously surreal to feel like an actual dream.
But men call us by a single name, a name which strikes fear into everyone's heart. They call us death!
The cinema of Dario Argento is the cinema of excess, undeniably. But while we think we've got Argento's style and cinematic language sussed, perhaps he's a little bit more complicated than we first thought. His work is notable for its use of colour, yet almost every Argento film looks different from the previous. His films revel in the brutal slaying of women, yet his approach to gender identity is surprisingly progressive. His films don't make sense, but if you approach them as dreams, imaginary spaces which render logic obsolete, they make perfect sense. Argento once said, "When I stop making movies, I'll understand my work better." Well, when that time comes, Dario, be sure to let us know.